Okay, this is Canto 2, and I'm going to do a short summary of it, and I'm going to do a reading, and then I'm going to do a reflection at the end. And these will be broken up in chapters so you can skip ahead to whatever section you find most useful for purposes of your own choosing. So, basic things before we get into it. This is a canto that involves a lot of different narrators. There are 5 different narrators within this canto. And so when you get to the reading portion of it, one thing I have done is I've broken up the text into colors for each speaker, and I put their photo up next to it. Well, a photo of a piece of artwork that shows them, so that you can figure out who's speaking at any given time, because there's not only that, but there's a flashback within a flashback. We'll talk about it at the end. Okay, plot summary of Canto 2. First of all, Dante is having met his mentor in the previous canto and knowing this journey that they're about to go on to down into the underworld. He's at first quite enthusiastic, and then he starts to think about it a little bit more, perhaps a little too much, and he starts to consider another figure who has gone down, which is, of course, the character of Virgil's own poem, the Aeneid. Aeneas does a journey down into the underworld, and as Dante thinks about this, he realizes that this is a God-ordained journey down into the underworld that leads to the founding of Rome, and then ultimately to the seat of St. Peter, the Bishop of Rome, where it's kind of the foundation, the cornerstone of the church itself. And so he's intimidated by the sheer scale of that. And then also he thinks about someone else who has a divine mission, like the Apostle Paul, and he says to himself, I'm neither of these people. Well, actually, he says it quite openly to Virgil, that I am not Aeneas and I am not Paul. And maybe it would be a mistake for me to go on this. Maybe we would regret it after the fact because I'm unworthy of these things. Virgil then responds that he's a coward. And in order to get him to move on, in order to get him to be willing to take the steps down into the underworld, he's going to let him know how this all came about. And this is where we go into a flashback, where Virgil is down in limbo, where the virtuous pagans are, where they're not suffering, but they're without God. We'll get to it later. Then a woman appears to him who identifies herself as Beatrice. And Beatrice is aware that a friend of hers is in need, and she wants to send Virgil to help. So she's aware of Dante's problems, and she wants to send Virgil to help him. Virgil agrees right away, but he's so shocked by the presence of this divine woman who has come from where she was at in heaven, being that Beatrice was a figure that Dante knew in his youth who died in probably her late 20s, if she is in fact a real person. And she's up in heaven. What's she doing down here, and is she not afraid to come down? She explains she's not really afraid to come down into limbo and into hell because she's under divine protection. And this divine protection she expounds upon by giving a flashback within this flashback. So we're in double flashback now, where Mary saw that Dante was lost, and she was weeping for him. And so she goes to Saint Lucia, and she sends Saint Lucia to find Beatrice, because she's aware that Beatrice has a connection to Dante. And Lucia goes to Beatrice up in heaven and says, are you not concerned about this friend of yours? Are you not looking out for his good? Is this not a man who loved you so much that it actually helped drive him towards goodness? And Beatrice is so wounded by this entreaty, which comes from Mary through Saint Lucia to Beatrice, that she gets up and she goes down to Virgil to get his help. And so then Virgil, we go out of the flashbacks and up into the regular story, and he says, you have these 3 Benedite women, these 3 blessed women who are working on your behalf in heaven. How can you possibly doubt How can you possibly lose trust in the goodness of what I'm offering you, and in the true and valid opinion of these women? And so this gets Dante feeling as though he's capable again. And so he moves forward in this, surrenders his will to his teacher and his master. He does it very explicitly, and then they head off. One other note right at the beginning is you'll see Dante calling upon the muses to help his memory, because he often says that he has trouble describing the things that he sees and that his memory won't quite hold it. And so he gives an entreaty to the muses, just like the ancient Greeks. O muse, O memory, so on and so forth. When you're seeing that, bear in mind that there's two different Dantes here. There's Dante the pilgrim, who's the guy in the story who's talking, and then there's Dante the poet, who is telling us the story of what happened. And so those are two separate voices, and just be aware that they are distinct from each other going in. And with that, let's get into the second canto. Day was departing, and the embrowned air released the animals that are on earth from their fatigues, and I, the only one, made myself ready to sustain the war, both of the way and likewise of the woe, which memory that errs shall not retrace. O muses, O high genius, now assist me. O memory, that didst write down what I saw, here thy nobility shall be manifest. And I began, Poet, who guidest me, regard my manhood if it be sufficient, ere to the arduous pass thou dost confide me. Thou sayest, that of Silvius the parent, while yet corruptible, unto the world immortal went, and was there bodily. But if the adversary of all evil was courteous, thinking of the high effect that issue would from him, and who, and what, to men of intellect unmeet it seems not, for he was of great Rome, and of her empire in the imperial heaven as father chosen, to which and what, wishing to speak the truth, were stablished as the holy place wherein sits the successor of the greatest Peter, upon this journey, whence thou givest him vaunt. Things did he hear which the occasion were, both of his victory and the papal mantle. Thither went afterwards the chosen vessel to bring back comfort thence unto that faith, which of salvation's way is the beginning. But I, why thither come, or who conceits it? I not Aeneas am, I am not Paul, nor I nor others think me worthy of it. Therefore, if I resign myself to come, I fear the coming may be ill-advised. Thou art wise, and knowest better than I speak. And as he is, who unwills what he willed, and by new thoughts doth his intention change, so that from his design he quite withdraws, such I became upon that dark hillside, because, in thinking, I consumed the emprise, which was so very prompt in the beginning. If I have well thy language understood, replied that shade of the magnanimous, thy soul attainted is with cowardice, which many times a man encumbers so. It turns him back from honored enterprise, as false sight doth a beast when he is shy. That thou mayest free thee from this apprehension, I'll tell thee why I came, and what I heard at the first moment when I grieved for thee. Among those was I, who are in suspense, and a fair saintly lady called to me, in such wise I besought her to command me. Her eyes were shining brighter than the star, and she began to say, gentle and low, with voice angelical, in her own language, O spirit courteous of Mantua, of whom the fame still in the world endures, and shall endure, long-lasting as the world, a friend of mine, and not the friend of fortune, upon the desert slope is so impeded upon his way that he has turned through terror, and may, I fear, already be so lost that I too late have risen to his succour, from that which I have heard of him in heaven. Bestir thee now, and with thy speech ornate, and with what needful is for his release, assist him so, that I may be consoled. Beatrice am I, who do bid thee go. I come from there, where I would fain return. Love moved me, which compelleth me to speak. When I shall be in the presence of my Lord, full often will I praise thee unto him. Then paused she, and thereafter I began. O Lady of Virtue, thou alone through whom the human race exceedeth all contained within the heaven that has the lesser circles. So grateful unto me is thy commandment, to obey, if 'twere already done, were late. No farther needst thou ope to me thy wish, but the cause tell me why thou dost not shun the here descending down into this centre, from the vast place thou burnest to return to. Since thou wouldst fain so inwardly discern, briefly will I relate, she answered me, why I am not afraid to enter here. Of those things only should one be afraid which have the power of doing others harm. Of the rest, no, because they are not fearful. God in his mercy such created me, that misery of yours attains me not, nor any flame assails me of this burning. A gentle lady is in heaven who grieves at this impediment, to which I send thee, so that stern judgment there above is broken. In her entreaty she besought Lucia, and said, Thy faithful one now stands in need of thee, and unto thee I recommend him. Lucia, foe of all that cruel is, hastened away, and came unto the place where I was sitting with the ancient Rachel. Beatrice, said she, the true praise of God, why succourest thou not him who loved thee so? For thee he issued from the vulgar herd. Dost thou not hear the pity of his plaint? Dost thou not see the death that combats him beside that flood where ocean has no vaunt? Never were persons in the world so swift to work their weal and to escape their woe as I, after such words as these were uttered, came hither downward from my blessed seat, confiding in thy dignified discourse which honors thee and those who have listened to it. After she thus had spoken unto me, weeping, her shining eyes she turned away, whereby she made me swifter in my coming. And unto thee I came, as she desired. I have delivered thee from that wild beast, which barred the beautiful mountain's short ascent. What is it then? Why? Why dost thou delay? Why is such baseness bedded in thy heart? Daring and hardihood why hast thou not? Seeing that 3 such ladies, Benedight, are caring for thee in the court of heaven, and so much good my speech doth promise thee. Even as the flowerets by nocturnal chill bowed down and closed, when the sun whitens them, uplift themselves all open on their stems. Such I became with my exhausted strength, and such good courage to my heart there coursed, that I began, like an intrepid person. O she compassionate who succoured me, and courteous thou, who hast obeyed so soon the words of truth which she addressed to thee. Thou hast my heart, so with desire disposed to the adventure, with these words of thine, that to my first intent I have returned. Now go, for one sole will is in us both, thou leader, and thou Lord, and Master thou. Thus I said to him, and when he had moved, I entered on the deep and savage way. All right, now it's time for a little bit of the breakdown of this, and I'm going to try to be kind of swift, but I'm not wanting to break it into 2 videos like I did in the previous one. I'm going to try and keep it self-sustained and just let this be a longer video. That's what we'll go with. So at the beginning of this canto, we see that day is departing, so night is falling, and all of the animals are being released from their work, their fatigues. And he's the only one who's making himself ready to sustain the war, both of the way and likewise the woe. And this is when he calls out to the muses for the help in his memory in describing even the things that began. Due to their complexity and their divine nature, it's as though the mind doesn't quite hold on to it with the same amount of purchase that one would require for description. So he cries out to them, and then he goes to his Dante the Pilgrim's conversation with the poet. And he's concerned. He says, before we go off onto this pass, thou sayest that of Silvius, the parent. So He's talking about here Aeneas. While yet corruptible, unto the world immortal went. So into the underworld, the world of the undying. Of the undead, I should say. And was there bodily. So not as a spirit, but as a physical body. This is something that we'll see sort of dictated through the theology of Dante as we go in, that the resurrection has not occurred. And so the resurrection of the body has not occurred. Those who are in the Inferno, those who are in purgatory, those who are in paradise are there in spirit. And so their bodies have not yet been reunited to them. And as a result, they are shades of varying levels of transparency. Dante's body and his presence of the physical body is usually a shock to the people that he encounters at these various stages of the afterlife. And he's mentioning, given a little foresight here, where we encounter that, where going bodily into the underworld is something that Aeneas did. And he goes into kind of the founding of Rome as a consequence of this act of Aeneas, and that is also interesting because it gets to a medieval mindset that is sometimes lost in contemporary notions of theology. The idea that the ancient world was setting itself in preparation for the coming of Christ. This is actually something of a thesis that you'll even see on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, because there are non-biblical prophets shown up on the ceiling with biblical prophets, like the Libyan Sibyl. That's one example. The idea being that anything that was said true by men ultimately alluded to Christ. And so there were things that Aristotle said, there were things that Virgil said, there were things that Socrates said that were fundamentally true and were pointing back towards God. In fact, he even alludes to later Aristotle's argument from motion on the existence of God. In fact, that might have even been in Canto 1. So all things, all good things that have been said by men belong to the Christian, as how Justin Martyr put it. That you can reason yourself towards a certain understanding of God, and that all of the world was being set up to, in spite of its flaws, its clear flaws. He does not attempt to redeem, and medieval theology does not attempt to redeem the pagan world. But what they do is they show, or in the very least believe, that they are able to show how the pagan philosophy led to the establishment of the Christian kingdom, even up to the point of the Roman Empire literally providing the infrastructure by which Christianity traveled, because he mentions the Apostle Paul here in just a little bit, and Paul was enabled by the Roman Empire. He even invokes his citizenship at one point during the book of Acts in order to get himself out of a pickle. So Rome, for Dante, the Roman Empire, was part of the process that would bring about Christendom and would bring about the spread of the gospel. Okay. And he says, I am not Aeneas, I am not Paul, nor I nor others think me worthy of it. This is such an immediate reminder of what we see from Moses in the beginning of the book of Exodus, where he is highly resistant to God's call. There's a humility that's incumbent, and even a little bit of self-loathing, it seems to come across in Moses' case, where he talks about how he's not a speaker. And I know some of that is excuse-making as well. And some of that is excuse-making here for Dante. I think we're seeing both of those things. Some real humility, some excuse-making, because if it was true humility, which would be an accurate assessment of the self, Virgil would not come back and say, you're being a coward, which he does immediately thereafter. So this is a humility that's mixed with something else. And our humility can sometimes be a product of despising ourselves rather than a true humility, which is an accurate assessment of one's value. Humility would always recognize that there's an incumbent worth, and then also that as a chosen vessel, as Paul is referred to here, the act is truly God, not the man who is doing it. And you'll see that Dante learns a bit of that lesson as he goes forward, especially into Purgatorio. I'm reminded also of Gideon, because Gideon says that in the book of Judges that he is part of the least tribe and the least member of his family. So he's sort of bottom rung, and yet he's chosen. So there's a biblical theme in here that you can pull many different angles from, with how Dante is responding to this initial call to this great task that he's being invited to participate with. And so then he says, therefore, if I resign myself to come, I fear the coming may be ill-advised. It could turn out to be a bad idea. And this is one of the things that Virgil will directly counter, is that this is a bad idea. And he'll bring citations from heaven. Thou art wise and knowest better than I speak. We at least see right here that his heart is in the right place, though, in that he will defer to a greater wisdom. And so he changes his mind. He says, because in thinking I consumed the emprise. He, in thinking, took himself further than he needed to go. He did not exercise proper prudence in being properly analytical and not excessively analytical with his thought. And then here comes the poet, Virgil, in return. If I have well thy language understood, replied the shade of the magnanimous, thy soul attainted is with cowardice. You're yellow. That's what he says. In a different way of thinking. Which many times a man encumbers, so it turns him back from honored enterprise. A false sight doth a beast when he is shy. I like that idea of an animal that's skittish. The cowardice sends it fleeing. And so then he tells of the coming of Beatrice. And Beatrice is a wonderful character from Dante's past. And so the readers of the Divine Comedy would have more than likely been familiar with his La Vita Nuova. It took me a long time to remember that. The New Life that he writes, which is his romance elements, his romance poetry. And in that, Beatrice is the key figure. He meets her as a young child. And then her beauty, which is always a distant beauty. He doesn't have a relationship with Beatrice. He sees her from afar at various points in his life. And he frequently faints, which you'll see him do in Inferno as well. And what it is that the love that he has for her is a love of her beauty and a love of her chastity and a love of all the things that she represents that are virtuous. And so those for him are an elevating concept that draws him towards God. And this is something else from medieval aesthetic theology as well, is that beauty is an orienting force. It directs us towards God. And you can find that in many forms. The key way that Dante found it was through Beatrice, was through her beauty. And so she's an important figure here. And her role in Dante's salvation is significant. And it's a significant principle for us, because whether or not it's Beatrice that we have as a guide, the idea that beauty is an orienting force towards salvation is important. The idea that beauty can draw us towards literal good and moral behavior is significant. So let's hold that in mind. Beatrice is the ultimate manifestation of that. She comes down and she talks to this spirit courteous of Mantua, of whom the fame still in the world endures and shall endure, long lasting is the world. We're going to see an element that continually comes up where one's fame in the world is not nothing. The good that you do on earth is not nothing. There's significance to it as well. And this gets to the Greek idea of kleos, this sort of earthly fame that we pull up for ourselves, this reputation that we build. And it fits nicely with the notion that you get in Proverbs that says that a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor rather than silver and gold. He is well beloved in the world, and this matters. And for some of the people that you see in Inferno, they're going to frequently allude to their acts on earth, both as justification and then sometimes as really all they have left to hold on to. It's not the highest thing. It's inadequate when it comes to the difference between divine love and kleos, our honor on earth. But it does matter. And we see the first hint of that here when that's how she speaks to him. That's how Beatrice speaks to him. Now, he immediately agrees to go. But he is confused as to how she would come down into limbo. And limbo is a state of suspension. He talks about these, let me find how he says, souls in suspense. And that doesn't mean that they're sitting there waiting for something scary to happen. What it means is they are suspended. And so this is the concept of limbo, where they're virtuous pagans who have not been redeemed by grace, because again, grace is unmerited, so you can't earn grace simply by good acts. So they're not suffering physically. Instead, they sort of live with a longing. And that's going to be the first circle of hell that we encounter. So just keep an eye on that as we go and see how that manifests. But that's what it's referring to here. She comes down into this place, and he is bewildered by it because it is still part of the Inferno. And he says that, he's curious as to how she has come down there without being afraid. And from the vast place thou burnest to return to, knowing that she deeply desires to return to heaven, because that is the place of the beatific vision, where she is in the presence of God. And since he wants to inwardly discern, she will relate to him. And she gives this wonderful line here: of those things only should one be afraid, which have the power of doing others harm, if the rest know, because they are not fearful. So if something does not have the capacity to harm in a way that is substantive and real, then we should not fear it. And she's under a divine protection, but it's more than just being shielded from anything. She cannot be harmed here. She is beatified. She is blessed. She has ascended unto heaven. But even here on earth, I think we can see that, because Jesus says something to this effect, as far as, do not fear those who can harm the body, but rather fear him who can throw the body and the soul into hell. Fearing what is proper, not having a spirit of timidity, of cowardice, which is what we see a little bit of in Dante here. And yeah, actually, I hadn't thought about that. There's a bit of a parallel there. Her comments on fear versus Dante's own fear. See, every time I read it, something new is coming up. And I read this thing about 4 times just before recording this. So Mary is having motherly tears. So going with this idea that is part of the liturgical tradition, both of Eastern Orthodox, Catholicism, etc., that Mary is kind of held aside as the mother. And that when Jesus is on the cross and he looks at John and he says, "Son, behold your mother," and then "Mother, behold your son," or vice versa, whichever he says first, that what he was talking about is her being a mother unto all the disciples, all of the apostles, all of Christians. And so what you're seeing here is a gentle lady is in heaven who grieves at this impediment to which I send thee. She's weeping. She's weeping as a mother weeps for a child. And in her entreaty, she besought Lucia, and she sends Lucia to go get Beatrice. Lucia is, in the name, is built the concept of light. In Latin, it would be lux. This is light. Lucia is related to that concept. And so as darkness falls in the world where Dante is, we're getting this idea of him being pulled out of the darkness with Lucia with light as the messenger. And she comes to where she's sitting with the ancient Rachel, which is an interesting little biblical reference. And in this case, Rachel was the beloved of Isaac. Wait, no, Jacob. Israel is what I was thinking. Is the beloved of Jacob. And Beatrice is the beloved of Dante. And she chastises a little bit, which is kind of interesting because what is really being gotten at here is the role that we have in mediating one another's salvation. So in the case of how it's happening here, it's in heaven that this intercession is taking place. But this is also getting back to that theme that we've mentioned before of our role in seeking out help in community and others helping us on our path towards salvation and to sanctification. So we get this drama that plays out that is an invention of Dante's to show us Mary weeping over a lost child, entreating other saints to aid, those who knew the person in life going and seeking aid for them. There's a mediation that's taking place to help bring Dante to salvation, just as we mediate for one another and helping to bring each other to salvation and to sanctification. And so she comes down, and it says, after she thus had spoken to me, this is Virgil speaking, weeping, her eyes shining as she turned away, whereby she made me swifter in my coming. There's a sweetness to that, the true sincere tears of sorrow for someone. I don't think that Virgil hastens his coming just because he feels sorry for her. I don't think it's just the compassion of a woman cries and he feels bad and he wants to go. I think the reality, the heaviness, the seriousness of the situation is given through those tears and the utter sincerity of this blessed woman, this woman who has her will been perfected because she's now in the presence of God. This is taken extremely seriously. And then it returns and we get this chastising fatherhood. And this is one of the hardest things for me as a father, is understanding how to properly chastise and challenge. Finding the right words to pull someone up, because words have this capacity to pull up and to push down. And the line between the two is very much based on the moment and based upon the relationship that's been built. And in this case, Virgil is able to be extremely straight with Dante. What is it then? Why dost thou delay? Why is such baseness bedded in thy heart? Daring and hardihood, why hast thou not? You have no endurance. You've got no spine. Why are you delaying? Seeing that 3 such ladies benedict are caring for thee in the court of heaven, and so much good my speech doth promise thee. What this does is it causes Dante to respond right. It reminds me of the passage, I cannot remember where Paul says it, where he says there's a kind of shame that leads to redemption. There's a kind of shame that leads to redemption. And so he chastises in that letter. I think it's one of the Corinthians. He chastises in that letter. And then even as the flowerets by nocturnal chill bowed down and closed, reference to the night again, nocturnal chill, bowed down and closed. When the sun whitens them, they uplift themselves all open on their stems. Such I became with my exhausted strength, and such good courage to my heart there coursed, that I began like an intrepid person. And then he goes into a statement here, but the chastising of Virgil lifted him up. This is admonition. This is when you have been corrected and you are uplifted. So often we allow our relationships with other people to be ruled by compassion. And compassion is so good up until the point of when it becomes all-consuming. And there comes a point where comforting a person is no longer good for them. Challenging a person is what they need. And that is painful. But that's the iron sharpening iron. That's the growing that comes of true and virtuous and honest and selfless criticism. Right judgment. This is when you do not have the plank in your eye and you can see to get the speck out of your brother's eye. Now go, for one sole will is in us both. This is Dante to Virgil. We are united in our will. Thou leader, and thou Lord, and master thou. This is submission. This is obedience. And thus I said to him, and when he had moved, I entered on the deep and savage way. I do not want to be an ungovernable Christian. I do not want to be someone who is unable to submit to a person who has a sincere love for me, a selflessness in their criticism, and experience that I do not possess. I want to have the wisdom and the discernment to submit when it's a good time to submit, and to be able to recognize the times when you should not submit. But that is judgment. And what we're seeing here is this play out between two characters in a proper way. They could be used as a pattern for how I think about concepts of submission before I enter on the deep and savage way. That's pretty much it for this one, for this beautiful canto, which is the last one before we actually enter into the gates of the Inferno, which is where we're headed next in Canto 3.